Well, I imagine that Jesus would have to be aware of himself as the salvation. And
Right.
if that's the case, he'll need to be aware of what he's saving people from.
He's brilliant. Hi, I'm Glenn. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. Is the new atheism dead? This interview between Alex O'Connor and Richard Dawkins, if it's not the death of the new atheism, I think these are the death throes. Alex does a fantastic job of putting to Richard Dawkins every question that I would ever want to ask Richard Dawkins, and his answers are shown to be so wanting. We've already done a video about Alex O'Connor raising the question that C.S. Lewis posed: what if Hamlet understands everything about the world that Shakespeare has written for Hamlet? Hamlet's understanding of that world does not exclude the existence of Shakespeare. And our knowledge of how the laws of nature operate does not in any way exclude the existence of God. He put that brilliant analogy to Richard Dawkins, and Richard Dawkins showed himself not to even understand the analogy, let alone to have a satisfying answer for it. In the next section of the interview, Alex O'Connor asks Richard Dawkins about Jordan Peterson and the Jordan Peterson phenomenon.
I enormously respect his courage in standing up to the Canadian laws about free speech. So I want to just get that out of the way first. I hugely respect that and value him for that reason. When he talks about religion, I think it's bull. I think that he doesn't make any sense at all. I think he's impressing people by using language they don't understand, rather like Deepak Chopra.
Oh, wow.
Where people think, oh, it must be terribly profound because I can't understand it, which is not something I can respect.
Now, in truth, I think Jordan Peterson is more of an evolutionary biologist in the ways that he speaks of religion than Richard Dawkins is. Richard Dawkins, having written The Selfish Gene, says that memes are as important in a population surviving as genes are. Memes are the things that do not kind of pass on genetically to people, but they are the sorts of forms of culture and ideas that can spread through a society and turn a certain tribe into something that is going to outcompete its opponents, and therefore it confers an evolutionary advantage on certain populations, and that's what drives evolution. What drives evolution is not simply genes, but also memes. And people like Jordan Peterson are taking that seriously and saying, well, religion is this universal meme that has shown up in every human population that we've discovered. Surely it has conferred an evolutionary advantage on people. And drawing on the work of other people like E.O. Wilson and David Sloan Wilson and Jonathan Haidt and other evolutionary psychologists who are, I think, more true to Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene than Richard Dawkins is. Okay, so like to put Jordan Peterson on the same level as Deepak Chopra, just because Richard Dawkins doesn't understand the sorts of language that Peterson is speaking in, that doesn't make him a Deepak Chopra. It might mean that there are ways of speaking that Richard Dawkins needs to learn. He needs to learn the sorts of language. He needs to learn a development of the language that he invented when he started to talk about memes.
Michael Shermer told me that he tried to pin him down and said, do you actually believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? And Jordan Peterson said, it would take me at least 2 days to answer that. So Michael said more or less, well, how about one sentence or one word? No.
Which is an incredibly Christian instinct that Michael Shermer has, another atheist, as well as Richard Dawkins has. We want there to be this capital T truth that stands above biological reality, the realm of the flesh. We want there to be truth that is not simply flesh. Okay, that's an incredibly Christian thing. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word became flesh, and the Word entered the realm of flesh. But Christians don't believe what pure evolutionary biologists believe, which is that everything is just the realm of the flesh. So why are you looking to a Logos above the flesh? When you start to ask Jordan Peterson, did it really happen in history, you're asking him a profoundly Christian question, actually, and you're finding him wanting at that point. It's not that Jordan Peterson is into woo and Deepak Chopra stuff. He is into pressing into biological reality in a richness that I think is sometimes lacking in Richard Dawkins. And what Richard Dawkins doesn't like about Jordan Peterson at that point is that Jordan Peterson is insufficiently Christian, actually.
And that's how I feel about that. All the stuff about Jungian archetypes, and not that I would be skeptical about that, but constantly dragging them in. I mean, I think the most egregious example of that is where he looks at works of primitive art, works of tribal art, where he shows things like two snakes coiling around each other and says, well, they must have had some primitive, primeval knowledge of DNA. Perhaps they looked into their own cells in some sense and saw the DNA. Perhaps the DNA is the double helix is a Jungian archetype. I mean, that is sheer bullshit, and I told him so.
I've never heard him say that.
Do you think that you can have a
that,
productive conversation with him about religion if this is the approach he's taking? Do you think there's any room for progress here, talking to someone like Peterson?
Well, I hesitate to say no about that to anybody, but I have so far I'm not given any confidence, and I want to once again say how much I respect his courage in standing up to the woke nonsense.
Yes, we sandwich the bull in between the respect.
Someone needs to meme that. Sandwich the bullshit in between the respect. It's a bullshit sandwich in between two slices of respect. No, I think Jordan Peterson sometimes says some nonsense things. I haven't heard him say that the snake thing is the double helix and people somehow intuited that. I don't think it's central to what Jordan Peterson says. But where Dawkins wants to correct him, Dawkins wants him to be more Christian, actually. Right? Or he's at least challenging him to be more Christian and suspects that because the Christian stuff is bullshit, so Jordan Peterson's stuff is bullshit. But wow, this interview is just fascinating, and again, kudos Alex O'Connor.
Peterson's approach here seems to have unlocked a new interest in particularly the Bible, and as he calls it, the biblical corpus. My friend Chris Williamson asked him recently on a podcast, because he kept talking about the biblical corpus. He said, when you say the biblical corpus, do you mean the Bible? He says, yes. And I'm thinking, well, why not just call it the Bible then? But he has inspired this renewed interest in the biblical corpus because of that. Because now when you see people debating religion, it tends to be less does God exist and more about the utility of religion and the Jungian archetypes and stuff. The God Delusion, which was the atheist book, do you think it still survives as a sufficient treatment of God and religion in modern culture? If you were to write it again, would you be taking the same approach of talking about it as a scientific issue, or would you feel the need to change the way that you're talking about the subject
I would
altogether?
certainly still talk about it as a scientific issue, because I think that's the most important thing. I probably might add a chapter on the idea of what Dan Dennett calls belief in belief. Where the
Ted Lasso?
I believe in belief.
Whether you believe it or not, it's a good idea that some people do, and I think that's patronizing. I think that's condescending. It's sort of saying, well, we intellectuals don't need this crutch, but other people may do, and if they do, then it's a good thing because it helps in the battle against Putin. Well, not that Putin himself is religious.
I think Voltaire said, "I don't believe in God, but I hope that my maid does."
Well, that's very good. I didn't know that quote. It's a very good example, and that is so patronizing.
Patronizing. If something helps you survive, it helps you survive, and surely that goes to the top of the tree of evolutionary success, okay? And why is there something that's true that is above evolutionary success if evolution is the only game in town? And this is a question that Alex will return to, but I don't think it's silly for people to say, okay, there might be a way for very secular people to understand what God might mean, and it might mean just helping people to understand that at the top of your hierarchy of values, there is something that is, for want of a better term, transcendent. that there is something that is a superordinate value that orders all other values. And let's call that God in the first instance. That's kind of the Petersonian project in terms of making the language of God seem plausible for people who had not had a language for God in the past. Now, Christians rightly come along to Jordan Peterson and they say, well, that doesn't seem to be a classical definition of who God is. God as the source of all being is not just a super being within the created order. And Christians come along and they say, well, actually, classically speaking, God is not simply the top of a hierarchy of earthly powers, right? And so a lot of Christians might find Jordan Peterson insufficiently Christian and critique him from that angle, but it seems like Schirmer and Dawkins are wanting to critique Jordan Peterson also for being insufficiently Christian, or at least for not having the logos of truth above all biological reality as something that judges everything in the realm of the flesh. But to think that way, Dawkins, Schirmer, to think that way is a profoundly Christian way to think. So again, it seems to me like your critiques of Jordan Peterson are very Christian critiques.
You know, when you're debating the moral argument with people, when they say without God there could be no morality, and sometimes an atheist says, well, how dare you say that I can't be moral without God? And they say, I'm not saying you can't be moral without God, I'm just saying you can't ground your morality.
Yeah.
And yet, on the other hand, they say, but we need you to believe in God, otherwise society falls apart. Maybe you are actually saying that people can't be moral without God, more than just their ability to ground it, if you're saying that without this religious belief, society will fall apart.
That's a good challenge. Let me respond. Alex is exactly right to say that Christians, when they make moral arguments about the existence of God, they're not saying that non-Christians can't be moral. They're saying that nobody has a pole star by which we can orient our moral lives unless we think that there is a truth and a goodness that is above biological reality, above the life of the flesh. And so we're kind of saying, yes, the atheist can be even more moral than I can, but the idea that we can even say that there's a comparative of more moral and less moral, it's because there is something that is superlatively moral above the biological reality that you and I are part of. And so the moral argument for God's existence is not that people of God are more moral. It's just that we can only have that category of objective moral values if there is indeed one who is goodness himself. And so Alex correctly identifies that this is the way that Christians argue. He's also noticing that some Christians are saying, and we need Christianity as a bulwark against all sorts of nihilism and relativism and wokery and whatever else it is. And that Christians seem to be wanting to use Christianity instrumentally in order to have a moral population. And he's saying, well, pick, like which is it? And to that, I would say, that can never be the bottom line of why you become a Christian, right? But it is not wrong for people to point out that in the absence of a pole star, in the absence of a story in which there is superlative goodness, there is no wonder that certain societies can lose track of ultimate goodness and can descend into ever more relativism and nihilism, and also into this kind of subjective self-righteousness that hurls accusations at one another. That all can happen ever more as we depart from a story in which there is superlative goodness, in which Jesus is Lord, right? So both those things are true. I think a Christian, at the end of the day, says, yes, goodness is goodness, whether or not people follow goodness or not, whether or not it creates a better society or not, goodness is goodness. That is the fundamental position that Christians have. But Christians can also point out, can't they, that in the absence of telling the Jesus story of one who is so good he gives his life for the world, in the absence of that, perhaps it is not surprising if societies ever more devolve into you do you kind of morality. I think both those things can be true together.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I recognize that some people may think that. I mean, I think that to ground your morality certainly in the Bible would be an appalling thing to do. If you actually look at the Bible, actually look at almost any of the moral lessons you can take from it. And some of the things Jesus said are very nice, but you have to pick and choose your way through. And
pick and choose according to what? And you have to say some things are more moral and some things are less moral. What is the pole star above that actually decides for you? And if you're going to do a purely evolutionary account of the world, then really what you're going to have to pick and choose is what will help your population to survive better than other populations can survive. Now, Richard Dawkins doesn't seem to want to be that relativistic, actually. He seems to be wanting to say that there are some things Jesus says that are A-OK and some things that Jesus says that are not A-OK. And he seems to think that there is a goodness that stands above those things. I'm waiting to hear what this Platonic ideal is, because it would have to be something like a Platonic ideal. I don't think it could be anything that is natural to humanity, because what is natural to humanity is not kindness and compassion. What is natural to humanity is the war of all on all, okay? And yes, there might be some pro-social behavior that confers an evolutionary advantage on you. It might be good if we're in the same tribe, if I pick nits off you and then you pick nits off me. If we help each other to gather berries, if we help each other to defend ourselves against that tribe, then we, through that pro-social behavior, confer a slight evolutionary advantage on our guys, but we confer the advantage on our guys against those guys. We cooperate in order to compete. And written into biology is not this universalistic, humanistic value of, the inviolable worth and dignity of all people or human rights. Those things are not found in nature at all. But if nature is all there is, where are the pole stars? Where are the inviolable worth and dignity of all people? Where is that stored? Where is that? And it seems to me that either, like Richard Dawkins is a Platonist, or he has to kind of descend into the biological realm, in which there are not those same objective moral values. Or perhaps he should just become a Christian, because he seems to want to have the goodness that is superlative and the biological reality that we can study. And it seems to me that the Word and the flesh come together in Jesus. It seems to me no wonder that Richard Dawkins has exactly the instincts and the intuitions that he has, because he's been formed by a Christian culture that proclaims the Word and the flesh.
Setting aside Jesus's emphasis on loving your neighbor, which is very nice. The Sermon on the Mount is very nice.
Nice? Nice? Sermon on the Mount is nice. Oh my God, like turn the other cheek. Right? Go the extra mile for the soldier who's commanding you to march with his backpack on you. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. That's not nice. And there's in the natural realm, that's bonkers, isn't it? The only way I think we can see the Sermon on the Mount as nice is we've lived in a culture that's been built by it, really.
The fundamental doctrine of, the Old Testament, of course, is appalling, but even...
Yeah, putting the Old Testament aside, in the New Testament...
Even the New Testament, the idea that we're born in sin is a hideous idea. The idea that...
Says the author of The Selfish Gene.
The only way to be saved from sin and the wages of sin is Jesus' death, is a hideous idea.
It is the parallel of a biological idea that we already all assent to. We already know that I'm born into the world full, like if you mapped my genome, you'd find all sorts of gene deletions, you'd find all sorts of predispositions to certain diseases, you might find certain diseases already in the genome, right? And I didn't choose that. But I'm not born into this world as this neutral or perfect or pristine biological specimen, and then only if I choose badly, only if I choose to smoke, do I then get lung cancer. It's not like that. Some people can smoke and they live to 110. And some people contract lung cancer having never touched a cigarette. And how is that fair? But that is the biological reality that we're born into the world with. And I am a jumble of different weaknesses and different diseases. And in exactly the same way, Christians say that spiritually and morally, I have certain strengths and certain weaknesses. And just as you might be predisposed to liver cancer and I'm predisposed to lung cancer, right? In the same way, you might be predisposed to lust and I might be predisposed to pride. And the moral status of the human person is exactly the same kind of status as our biological status, which is that we are mixed bags and we are perishing. That's what the Bible kind of says. And hasn't Richard already written The Selfish Gene? I don't understand why he finds the fact that we might be genetically wired for selfishness to be an appalling or a repugnant idea. I tell you where he gets that idea from: a particularly post-Christian Enlightenment view that, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who hated the idea of original sin, that we are born free, but everywhere we are in chains, right? And there have been very Christian-ish understandings of the human person that react against biblical truths of original sin and come up with these Christian heresies of seeing the blank slate of human beings and seeing that we are born virtuous, or at least born neutral. There are some real Christian instincts in that particular Christian heresy. But the Bible says something that's much more profound, I think, and much more obvious. Pick up a newspaper if you disbelieve in original sin. Do an inventory, a moral inventory of your own life if you disbelieve in original sin. It kind of describes the human person, and it is part of a religion that has shaped a very successful civilization. And Richard, who are you to speak against a civilization that has been incredibly successful and fruitful in the way it thinks about itself? And it's not just Christians, like Chinese, ancient religions in the East have no problem with considering people to be born evil. It is a very particular post-Christian sensibility that says, I hate the idea of original sin. But you do have to stand somewhere when you look down at this belief and consider it to be morally repugnant. And I just find it really odd that the person who wrote The Selfish Gene looks at original sin and says that's repugnant.
And I don't think it's one that Jesus himself ever put forward, is it? I think he probably would be rather shocked at that thought.
This is brilliant. He's asking Alex O'Connor. Alex O'Connor here is about to give the best answer to this question that I've ever heard, okay? Now, again, is Alex O'Connor like a psyops kind of for the last 10 years? Has he been undercover as a Christian? And because I think the answers and the questions that he gives in this video are unbeatable. I don't think there's a Christian on the planet who could have done a better job opposite Richard Dawkins. That's fascinating. But look at the way Alex answers this question. It's perfect.
Well, I imagine that Jesus would have to be aware of himself as the salvation. And if that's the case, he'll need to be aware of what he's saving people from.
He's brilliant. Like, when he becomes a Christian, like, he will be the greatest evangelist. He really will. That's just a perfect answer.
Which can only be something like slavery to sin. Now,
I wonder whether you're reading something in there. I mean,
no, he nailed it. He nailed it. He nailed it.
I mean, he said things like, if you have seen me, you've seen the Father. He said that kind of thing. But did he actually say that he was salvation?
His name means savior, Richard. Like, he's constantly talking about it. Whoever sins is a slave to sin, but if the Son sets you free, you'll be free indeed.
Well, I suppose I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeah, but
no one comes unto the Father except through me. I am
a guide for a good life, something like that. It doesn't mean that he surely never said that my death is necessary in order for you to be saved from sin.
This is my body given for you, he says, as he tears it apart in his body. This is my blood shed for you, for the forgiveness of sins, right? It's like this is what Jesus. And so Alex O'Connor is brilliantly getting to the heart of the Adam and Christ story. And he's answering the question of who is the human person by looking to Jesus Christ and saying, well, Jesus, if he is the second Adam, if he's the answer to humanity, well, isn't it interesting that he calls himself the Savior? Well, he must be saving people from something. He's saving people from their sin. And if we're bound, as Jesus says in Mark chapter 10, he says, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. A ransom. Why? Because we're captive. What are we captive to? Sin. How do we get out of sin? Jesus offers his life as a ransom. What's he doing on the cross? He's dying my death for me that I might go free. This is Christianity. This is Christianity 101. Old Testament, New Testament. But Alex has answered the simplicity of it, the beauty of it, the clarity with which he just cuts through and just says, well, if Jesus is the answer to sin, let's work back from Jesus. I've got so much more to say about this interview. I'm going to return to it in future videos. But if you want to figure out the two-ness of the world and the way in which Jesus is the answer to humanity, he's the second Adam, as the Bible calls him, we've got a great course. It doesn't require any prior knowledge of Christian things. You can just come and see life according to Jesus, his vision for God, his vision for the world and its two-ness, its splitness, and his vision for you. It's called 321. Go to 321course.com. It'll ask you for a password. You can set up your own little account. We won't spam you. There is absolutely no charge. There's no in-app purchases. But you can just explore around and watch a whole bunch of videos. There's loads of content there. We'd love you to check out life according to Jesus. I'll return to this particular interview because I just think it is so fascinating. Won't you join us on this journey? Why don't you hit like and subscribe to this video so that we can catch you on the next one. We are Speak Life. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.